It's now time for one of the most popular segments in Super Podcast history, the Superpodcast Roundtable. And today we have three very special guests, one of whom was in love with Bull Nakano, one of whom was hit on by Bull Nakano, and one of whom observed it all and lived to tell about it. And I want to welcome Dave Meltzer, Kurt Brown, and Jeff Bowdren to the show. And now everyone's going to talk over each other, and it'll be a disaster, but everyone's here. Guys,
and now we're all silent.
I can either confirm or deny those allegations.
Well, guys, what we're going to talk about today is Japanese wrestling, especially in the 80s, and the trips you guys took to Japan. And if I can, I'd like to start with just your first impressions and when you first saw it. And Kurt, I'll start with you. And for this exercise, let's disqualify you seeing All Japan Women on TV in the late 70s in California. Let's go to just when you saw All Japan and New Japan. When did you first see it, and what were your first thoughts?
I first saw New Japan, actually, when I first knew Dave Meltzer, and Dave sent me a tape that had, it had a lot of stuff on it, from the Slaughter-Patterson alley fight to Flair versus Kerry Von Erich. But what totally stole it for me was the New Japan in early '83. It had the famous Dynamite Kid versus Tiger Mask match in April. And Dave, do you remember the six-man tag that featured Shoshu, Killer Khan, Shoshu Hamaguchi and Yatsu against Killer Khan, Isamu Teranishi, and I can't remember who the third one was, and they just suplexed Hamaguchi into oblivion and took apart the ring at the end.
They did one finisher after another on the guy, and at that point in time, we'd never seen anything like that. I mean, we'd never seen anything like any of the moves, and they did like 10 of them in a row. Yeah,
and the heat was amazing, and it meant something too, because after suplexing Hamaguchi all that time, they carry him out after the match. Yeah, that's before Hamaguchi ended up going with Choshu, because that was Choshu's army against IWE group. But it was that's when the Choshu group started really getting hot in New Japan. He'd actually gotten hot about a year earlier, but it was Ricky Choshu was hot, but that was for a while there. Then that whole Choshu's army got hot, and then of course they switched to All Japan in '84. And the emphasis on the junior heavyweights, and plus the international flavor was there's nothing like it, because you got people from everywhere, from Mexico, England, Germany. Yeah, I mean it was a big buffet.
Yeah, I used to love when they would bring, New Japan would bring, because All Japan was pretty Americanized. And, it was really Brody and Hansen and the Funks kind of dominated with Tsuruta and Tenryu and all them. But it was these, guys that you already saw in the United States. But New Japan would bring you these, like Karl Gotch, as old as he was, or, guys that did completely different styles. And, of course, the junior heavyweights, which were kind of an amalgamation, because Sayama was the key guy. So Sayama was a combination of Japanese training, but British style and Mexican style. And, all those places had styles, but there was no amalgamation of the three styles until really Sayama and Dynamite Kid were and Rollerball Rocco and those guys were the guys who really kind of put that all together. And I know that when I first started seeing them, and I'm sure other people thought this as well, but it was this is the future of pro wrestling. It's going to be like this. And I mean, it took a long time, but it did end up being the future of pro wrestling. And God, I remember all those years where the American promoters were just no one's going to ever buy guys. This is a joke. These guys will never. And when I'm going I've already seen it. It works. I bring the tapes to my friends in college who aren't even wrestling fans, and they love that, and they won't watch American wrestling. And it's I know it's going to work, but it was just that old hard-headedness in wrestling. And, it takes a long time to, you're taught one thing that, unless you're 220 pounds, you can't be a pro wrestler.
Yes,
and,
I remember that.
And, obviously in time that changed. But, yeah, that was I just remember the thing with Japan to me was what Terry Funk told me the first time I went. And it's pretty much true in the sense that you study Japan all the time, because as long as you do, you're always going to be 5 years ahead of the United States. And people hate to hear that, but it really has, historically been, as far as in-ring style, and a lot of business things too. It's been the case. And sometimes it's 10 years ahead.
Well, in fact, I remember you telling me that you talked with Terry Funk before you actually saw the All Japan Women, and you asked him, I hear they're better than the men, and you said, Funk hesitated a moment and go, yep, they are. Well, remember how in the 90s guys started emulating the women's moves?
Right. Yeah, the younger guys would watch the All Japan Women and start copying them. Yeah, and that style of the All Japan Women, became, kind of a template of not the full style, but of things to like copy. With both men and women. It's funny because I like today. You've got this is what's so interesting about the women wrestlers of today, and they're all different. But it's funny when I meet the women wrestlers of today. They'll always bring up, like Bull Nakano, Asha Kong, Manami Toyota as like their inspirations. And, before, like 20 years ago, they wouldn't even know who those people are. It was like, because the world was so isolated in comparison. But I do know, like when I first went, which was the first time I went to Japan in '84, was the height of the Crush Gals era. And, like you just walk down the street and there's posters of Chigusa and Asuka everywhere. You just know they're over in culture. They're not just wrestling people. And you see it and you're inundated by it. And it's kind of like, what is this? And it was funny because you'd have some wrestlers go, what a joke, 130-pound women wrestlers, ha ha ha. And it was Funk and Brody who were the ones going, like, and Funk was the one, like, because I hadn't really watched them. I'd seen them a little bit on, like on TV because the Fuji Network was on cable in San Francisco. So I'd seen some of it, and it kind of was like, it was so good that I was kind of like repelled by it. I had the mentality that some people have if they see like really good Japanese wrestling and all they've seen is WWE, and it's just like, I can't watch this. I'm figuring out a way why it doesn't work and it's no good. And I kind of had that. That's how I can relate to that. Is I kind of was like, oh my God. Or remember Kurt? I know you saw it. I don't know if Jeff saw it, but you might have. Do you remember the movie? I think it was All the Marbles, right?
Oh yes.
So All the Marbles. I went to the movies, and the wrestling scenes in All the Marbles were so freaking awesome because it was the Japanese. Yes. The Japanese women were the stunt women. So essentially, you're watching, not American pro wrestling, but Japanese women's pro wrestling, and it's like the greatest thing you ever saw. But when I went there, it was like Terry Funk was like, you gotta study them. You got to study them because they're really good. And Brody was the same thing. They're better than the men. But other guys were just like, oh, come on, it's a joke. And the Japanese fans, the Japanese male fans weren't that into them at that point. It was like, yeah, they're good, but it's for little girls. And you guys know by going to the shows. Jeff, when you went with me, there were 15 guys, 10 guys in the Corcoran Hall total, you think?
Well, and there was a group of the Americans that were all cheering for Dump.
Yeah.
And then she was blowing them kisses.
Yeah. That's awesome.
So, but no, the crowd was like 95% teenage girls.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Because I remember, as Brian alluded to earlier, my very first exposure to Japan Women was in the 70s when they aired it on one of the local Asian stations here. And the wrestling was good, but it wasn't nearly as good as the mid-'80s. No,
right.
But what blew my mind was, one, the introduction to the show. The only introduction better than that was the CMLL intro in the mid-'80s, where they showed the old clips of Galindo and Santo. But to see the beauty pair, singing their theme song while all the streamers are being thrown, and there's all these shots of little girls in clusters holding posters outside the arena, and I'm just saying, holy shit, there's no American wrestling that has this passionate a following that I know of.
Yeah, they were.
Of course, that was 1977 when LaBelle was falling apart.
Local wrestling was horrendous. Yeah.
I didn't have too high a bar, I got to admit.
There are very few groups that ever had that kind of reaction. I guess it's really All Japan Women, and to an extent, World Class would be the next one on the list.
Yes.
I think Mid Atlantic in the Rock and Roll Express and Dusty Rhodes era was pretty hot. World Class was pretty big. The thing with World Class, because living there that 1 year, culturally it was real big. I don't know. But I do remember in that 97, 98, 99 period, even 2000. When WWF and to an extent WCW, Bill Goldberg and all that were culturally really big too. I think that was almost comparable, but Dallas with the Von Erichs and everything, it was really a unique thing that's hard to really explain to people unless they were there or were watching it as it happened. And it was a really short window, but it was really big culturally in the sense that everybody knew the Von Erichs and they were like, if you were in school, they were kind of like your the fantasy, boyfriends of all the girls and the big brothers of all the boys. I mean, it was really like a weird cultural thing that I never saw anywhere else in wrestling in the United States anyway.
I think, Dave, one of the differences when you're comparing World Class to the All Japan Women is I actually printed out the issue from right when you came back, and you were talking about Dump's appeal as a heel, as it were, where you talked about when Dump walked down the street in Tokyo, that the teenagers were afraid of her. Whereas I think like the Freebirds, it was more like you wanted to kick their ass, but Dump, they were legitimately afraid of her.
Well, she had such a great aura of being a monster that, I think that she was really like, as big as the Crush Gals were, without her, I don't think that they'd come anywhere. Like every great babyface needs that adversary, and she was that adversary. And Bull Nakano was like her understudy, her number two. But Dump was the personality that brought out and, made the Crush Gals such heroines for standing up to this, 250-pound face-painted monster that was hitting him with the tin cans,
jabbing him in the forehead with a fork.
Yeah.
And wearing the mirrored sunglasses with the swastika on her arm.
Yeah.
She was quite the visual spectacle.
Well, to take a step back, Dave, you said your first trip was in 1984, and that's an interesting time, too, because that's after all the internal implosions in New Japan in 83. You got to see the original version of the UWF when you went over in 84, correct?
Yeah, I sure did. I saw them probably right at their peak, the first version at their peak. Obviously, the later versions were much, much bigger. It was something. Watching people kick each other in the head really hard was weird to see. It was like watching combat, it wasn't, but the people took it as real. I mean, it wasn't, but they took it as real. But the thing I remember about it is they packed so many people standing room that in that building. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, you watch and you see the guys in the balcony and all that, but I mean, they had standing room in the aisles. I mean, it's like if there was a fire or something like that, it would have been a freaking disaster. Like the amount of people that they allowed in that place, for the UWF, because I don't think they turned people away. Maybe they did, but we got there and bought standing room tickets, and it was just so jammed, and it was a great show.
Dave, do you think
this was different?
Dave, do you think it was it just one guy? Was it Sayama or Maeda, or was it the whole group?
Sayama and Maeda were the stars, without a doubt. They were the draws, but I think it was the idea of people believing that it was real was the real draw. Because you remember, like with that UWF, it was really big in Tokyo, but it didn't. When they went on the road, they didn't draw that well, because the Tokyo fans were always like they were like ahead of the curve, and the small town fans were small town fans, and they, for them it was. They wanted to see the pro wrestling that they saw on television, whereas the Tokyo fans, they wanted to see something new because they got so much pro wrestling. That's why the first UWF really didn't make it, was because they couldn't draw outside of Tokyo very well.
Jeff, you, of course, ended up going to Japan in 1987. At the end of 1987, you met up with Dave, and Maeda is mixed in with this story, too, because that was the guy you really wanted to see on that trip.
Well, as I was saying a little bit earlier off the air, so I go over there, and Dave was already there with Dave, do you remember Johnny Black?
Johnny Black.
That was the guy that you were there with. His name was Dave from Philadelphia, but he said, "Please call me Johnny."
Cat.
Yeah, he always said, "Please call me Johnny Black. I don't want anyone knowing I'm over here." And
yeah, so Dave Cat. Yeah. I saw him in Cauliflower Alley the last year.
Anyway, so you guys are already over there. I fly into Nagoya. Somehow I managed, despite the fact I didn't speak the language, I got over to Nagoya, and I get over there, and it was just the craziest thing I've ever seen. I mean, I first, you would ask Kurt how he first got into it. When I began getting the Observer, Dave sent me one of his tapes. And I remember saying on another show that the match that really kind of appealed to me when I looked at the match listing was Greg Valentine versus Kerry Von Erich. And I thought to myself, I've never seen those two wrestle each other. That'd probably be an interesting match. It was the worst match on the tape because everything else on the tape, it started off with a match with Killer Khan against Ricky Choshu in a Texas death match. And I watched it, and we were laughing earlier. I said, that has to be one of my top 100 matches of the decade because it was the first match I ever saw from Japan. And it was just, and then of course it all leads into everything else. But the point you were making earlier, so I get over there and Dave walks up and he goes, well, hey, did you hear the big news? And I said, what? He goes, well, Choshu and Maeda, they're out of the tournament. And those are the two guys that I came over to see. and then I find out that Kobayashi's out because he's hurt. Funiaki has gotten in some trouble where he beat up a cab driver, so he's out. So for the best guys,
that's right. I remember we never saw Funaki on that tour either. That's right.
Oh, so that was a hell of a way to start the tour.
Yeah, but we still saw like all kinds of great wrestling though.
So I was reminiscing earlier. I don't know if you remember this. We went to a small New Japan spot show, and it was about 40 degrees in the building. And one of the matches was Takada and Osamu Kido versus the Von Erichs.
I remember this.
You remember what happened? So
was it when didn't Murdoch like in the middle of the match go like on the loudspeaker and go, "It's Miller time," right?
No, he looked at during Murdoch's match. He looked at the referee and he goes, "Petey, it's time for the go home." So, but during the Von Erichs match, I think it was Kerry was working with Takada in the ring, and he takes him in the corner and he goes, "Go ahead, shoot your shit, motherfucker."
No, that was Kevin. It was Kevin.
Oh, it was Kevin? Okay. And
it was Kevin. He goes, shoot your shit, motherfucker. And then Takada's like just kicking the hell out of him.
I think he hit him with 10 kicks in 5 seconds.
I mean, yeah, it was unbelievable how quick his feet were. Yeah.
Yeah. And we didn't hear much from Kerry after that, or Kevin after that. They quickly tagged out. It was fun. It's very interesting to see a spot show in a real small town where they don't mind calling stuff out in the middle of the ring because they figure no one can understand them.
No one understands English except we're sitting there and we understand it. Yeah, that was funny.
Yeah, that was good stuff.
Didn't you run into the Von Erichs again in the hotel, Jeff?
Oh, yes. So we're in the lobby of a hotel. I think it was in Nagoya. And
it was Nagoya.
Yeah, where all the American guys are staying. So they have these Japanese, like the fanboys that come, and they all have these photo albums, and they give the pictures to the, like this guy would come down and they'd hand him a photo, and sometimes they'd autograph it for him, or they just, here, I'm giving you this because I have this photo of you, and so Kevin and Kerry come down. And they start talking to us, and oh, what are you American guys doing here? Oh, yeah, we're over here to watch the wrestling. Oh, that's cool. So Kevin, it's just me and Dave. Kevin looks at us and goes, "Let me ask you guys a question. Any of you two know that dirt sheet writer from California?" And he holds his hand up in a claw. Like, if he meets Dave, by God, he's going to put the claw on him and really teach Dave a thing or two.
So you got there for both tag team tournaments, right, Jeff? It was All Japan and New Japan.
Yes, I got there. I think Dave was there for a little over 2 weeks. I was there for about 11 days.
And that was the year did you get to see, that's 87, so that would have been Brody and Hansen interacting on opposite teams for the first time, correct?
I think Dave saw that. I came right after that card.
Yeah. I didn't see it would have been Brody, and I didn't see Brody against Hansen in a match. But they would have had a match somewhere in that tournament, obviously.
Yeah, Brody and Snuka versus Hansen and Gordy. That was the match.
Right. That was right before I got there. They had the match at Corkin Hall, and everybody was talking about it. I got there like a few days after that. Everybody was talking about it like it was this, because that was another one where they completely jammed Corkin Hall. They had like 2,600 people in that 1,700-seat building. And, so it's like... And they did a no contest and everything, and it was building towards, they were going to do the big feud with, eventually with Brody against Hansen, which was going to happen in 1988, and Brody died right before they were going to kick the singles match off. So yeah, the last night was, it was Brody and Snuka, and it was Hansen. Was it Hansen and Gordy and Tenryu and Hara? I think were and then probably Tsuruta and Yatsu would have been the big four teams, and the Funks were in it that year too.
Yeah, I know the last night the Funks fought the Youngbloods.
Yeah,
that must have been great.
wasn't quite the equal of the main event.
No. But hey, Dave, from 1984 to 1987, and how many times did you go in between those years?
I don't think I went in between. Maybe once. I'm trying to remember. I remember going 84 and 87, and then I went about once a year through 96. I think I'd go about once a year, maybe every other year. So, and then I haven't been since 96 every year. Like this year, I'm probably the closest to going that I've ever been. If the Tokyo Dome wasn't a Thursday, if it was a weekend, I'd 100% be there, because now it's like, I promised my son a Japanese trip 3 years ago, and I still haven't delivered on it yet.
Oh, you
but
gotta.
but it's like I don't want him to miss school either, and he's got school, for January 4th. But that would be, and unfortunately, as weird as this is, they start school here like on August 10th. So I couldn't go for the last 3 days of G1 because he was already at school, and I didn't want to, So it's one of those weird things. But I am gonna go soon. I mean, especially like. Last year's Tokyo Dome, it's like, God, I probably should have gone. What an unbelievable night that was.
Bowdren may be hopping along there with you, I have a feeling, because he's a big New Japan fan right now. But between 1984 and 1987, had the crowd makeup at all changed in terms of how many Americans were going over there? Now it seems like every fan and their mother goes to Japan at some point.
No, not really. No, it's unbelievable when I look at at the G1 finals and I look at the crowd shots and I see people I know. And when I go to PWG, and I swear PWG, it's like everyone's going, oh yeah, we're going to the G1 finals and for 3 days. And it's like, it's commonplace. And I'm just thinking like, God, it's still not that many, but the last 2 or 3 years, from what I understand, the amount of Americans going to like the G1 finals in the Tokyo Dome has exploded.
Jeff, like around the time you go, this is when you really start getting into the newsletters, and also you went to Crockett Cup 86 in New Orleans, and that's where you found out about the Observer, right?
Yeah, I actually was sitting in front of a guy named Jeff Steele, who was a Mid-South UWF fan. And so we agreed to start swapping tapes. I got the Mid-South and UWF stuff, and he got the Dying Days of Florida. I think I made a lot better deal than he did. and what he did was, in one of the tapes that he sent me, he included an Observer. And I started reading it, and I'll never forget this, Dave. It was the issue right after Kerry had his motorcycle accident. And I'm reading this, and I'm like, what is this? Completely got invested in it, and that's when Dave was still, listing that he had Japanese tapes for sale, and I was hooked. Thanks a lot, Dave.
3 marriages later, and Jeff is with us here today.
Dave was indirectly responsible for, I would say, at least 2 divorces.
Whoa.
He put my marriage to the test right away. I invited him.
You just got married when you came, right?
I'd been married 3 years, but what happened is I invited you to the wedding, but you were unable to make it. But as a wedding gift, you sent me just this huge package full of Japan tapes, and we even had a note saying, if your marriage survives this, it'll survive anything.
Dave was actually an usher at my second wedding, I might say.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. But yeah, I was married 3 years when you called me and said, hey, want to hit Japan? The luchadors are coming. And God bless my wife, Elena, said, hey, if we have to get a line of credit out to do this, you're going. So,
what a trip that was, though. I mean, when I think
that was a blast. I had so much fun.
Well, the thing about that trip, aside from the fact that we saw those awesome Japanese women's matches, and obviously, got to see Asahi and Negro Casas and Blue Panther and all these guys in their own environment, and it was like the second or third, I think it was the second tour of the UWF, which was a, kind of a UWA-oriented Lucha Libre promotion. But the thing historically was we were there for the Misawa Jumbo Tsuruta match, which ended up, kicking off the golden era of All Japan, number one. And then when Tsuruta died, and then later when Misawa died, like on the network TV shows, those were so, it became this like legendary match. I mean, it kind of was like, even in the building that night, it's kind of like when it was over, it was kind of like, I thought like, oh my God, what did we just see? It was like,
oh, did you remember how we popped for the finish?
Well,
I mean, we both jumped up and screaming like kids.
But the thing that was unbelievable about that match was it's over. And I mean, I swear to God, I mean, I think that like 3/4 of the crowd was in tears. And I mean, it's more guys than girls. This isn't like an All Japan Women when Chigusa Nagayo is bleeding and all the women are screaming. This is just in tears.
And everybody's reaching out just trying to touch Misawa as he's leaving, like Night of the Living Dead, all these zombies reaching just to touch him.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because it's like, it is one of my favorite wrestling memories of actually being live at a match that was so historical, because it was like, that was really what kicked off of that big sellout streak that they had, Misawa going over. And like the whole knowledge of the fact that, Baba changed the finish, like an hour and a half before the card started, because he's sitting, remember how Baba would sit in the autograph thing, right? He'd sit in the back and there'd be all these people and then he'd sign autographs, and he was sitting there, and everybody, remember like in line and everything, and these Misawa chants were breaking out all night long, and it was just kind of like, because the Misawa had just unmasked, whatever it was, a couple weeks earlier.
And they had the tiger mask outfit on display in the ring that night, too, before the show started.
Yeah, but I mean, it was like all night long, Misawa, and it's like, what? You know, it's like, I knew that he was kind of over with the unmasking, but you almost have no idea how over he was that night. It was one of those weird, spontaneous things.
I've never seen anything like close to that. I mean, the closest I've seen was I was there when Ole turned on Dusty. I mean, those are the two live moments that I remember the best.
You were at the cage match in Atlanta?
I remember. What's that?
The cage match in Atlanta?
Yeah, the WFIA convention was there. And what's funny is right before the match started.
When Ole did that promo, that's like one of the greatest promos of all time.
Yeah.
Oh, it was amazing. I remember before the match started, I think it was Barry Rose said, "Hey, since they're all in the cage, do you think Ole and Gene are going to turn on Dusty?" And everybody's going, "Nah." And sure enough. But that was another time when I saw a lot of fans crying.
Yeah. Wasn't there one fan, the Jock, that you told me about that you saw crying?
Oh, God. He looked like a normal kid who would be like a Letterman in high school or something like that. He's walking around like with this just dazed look in his face, and he's crying, and then he just screams to the top of his lungs like in a really bad movie, "Dusty!" They don't make fans like that anymore.
Yeah.
It's still real to him, damn it.
That was one of the greatest, I have to say. I remember watching, because we got it on cable then, and I remember watching the TV the next, whatever it was, the next day or the next week. I think it was the next day, because it was the show on Friday and then TV's on the Saturday, and always.
That sounds right. Thursday or Friday, I think, was the show.
Okay, so yeah, they do the thing and they show the footage, and Ivan Koloff is there, and Gene was there, yeah, and just watching that whole thing go down, I just thought, God, this is freaking brilliant.
Yeah.
And then Ole did that interview, and yeah.
The Misawa Tsuruta match, I remember earlier in the day, do you remember Fumi Saito was saying, the rumor is they might be passing the torch to Misawa, and that piqued my interest right away.
Well, I knew that Misawa was being looked on to be eventually the next top guy, because that's when he unmasked. I figured it would be one of those things like they usually do where, Jumbo beats him like 4 times in a row, and then finally, 4 years from now, Misawa is going to actually beat Jumbo. I really didn't expect it that night, but watching the match, it was like the match was so special. Just watching it, I think that just, and it was, I remember when we watched it was like, God, if he won, it would be so unbelievable. But I never really believed that he would. And he won with kind of like this reversal into a cradle type thing. But when he won, it was just like, because deep down, everyone wanted him to win, and nobody believed he would win because, Jumbo was just ranked higher, right? And Misawa was on the way up. And it was just like, the reaction of that night was so big, and it just freaks me out because it was just like a guy sitting there watching the fans milling around the floor and the thing and seeing all the Misawa merchandise being sold, just going like, this is the night. You know what I mean? And he sent the word to Jumbo, because the original finish was Jumbo going over. And he sent the word to Jumbo, and he just goes, Misawa up, and then the messenger comes back to Baba, and Jumbo goes, do we go by count? Do we do a count out? Because remember, they used to do count out finishes all the time then.
Yes.
Although but by 90 they were getting away from it. But in the 80s it was always count. They did a lot of count outs, and this is when Baba was getting away from the count outs. And I remember the story is like the messenger from Jumbo goes to Baba, can we do a count out? And Baba looks at him and goes, no, and that's the finish. That was the story.
What fascinated me just as much as that match, this probably sounds silly, but, you're talking about how Bob was signing autographs in front. Remember when we went to a spot show in one of the towns, and there he was behind the gimmick table in his trunks and boots, signing autographs? With his big cigar. That was totally awesome to me. I mean, when you see him wrestle all these years, it's Baba, but you see him up close and see just how fucking big those feet were. And it just looked like he was in his element, like he was having the greatest time just sitting around signing autographs, sucking on a cigar. And I don't know, that was something cool to see up close.
That was a big dude. You know what I mean?
He was.
I mean, it's like I know there's NBA players that are like really, really tall, but I guess at that point in time, it was just like, what a big, I think when you're in Japan, when you're bigger than everyone, and then you see a Japanese guy who's like 6'9", it's just like kind of freaky to see.
Yeah, we had both seen him at Cauliflower Alley before, but there was something about seeing him in his trunks, those giant boots, and again, the cigar that was as big as his head. I mean, that was something, and he just struck me as somebody who was living life the way he wanted to. He looked like he's totally relaxed and in his own.
Yeah, I mean, he was like one of those really incredible wrestling characters that I think like it kind of too bad because it's been almost 20 years since he passed away. It's 18 years now, and it's like there's a whole like for a couple of years it's like everybody knew who he was, right? And now we've got like a whole generation of people who really like they may not even know the name, but they don't really understand the significance. And it's like this guy was like such a monumental figure in the industry. I mean, just as a promoter and as a hero to the Japanese people, as far as for decades, I mean, like legitimately, one of the 7 most famous athletes of the century, probably in Japan, whatever it is, I think they had at the end of the century, they had like the list, and I think he was 7th of the most famous athletes. Like Sad Haruo, who, and Nagashima were really famous baseball players, and there might have been a sumo here and there, and then Baba Inoki and Riki Dozan. Those were the guys.
In which order?
Nagashima was number 1. I remember.
No, I mean which wrestlers and the wrestlers in which order?
Well, I mean Riki Dozan was way, way bigger than Baba or Inoki, but by the end of the century, a lot of people had forgotten that too, because Riki Dozan in 2000, would have been dead for 37 years. But Riki Dozan was much bigger than any of them.
Now, am I remembering correctly that after Riki Dozan died, it was a bit of a scandal because it revealed the Yakuza ties and stuff, and that Baba was kind of like
the business went down for a couple of years, and it was Baba's popularity that brought it back.
That is
they
so
had
cool.
They had a couple of years where they struggled, and a lot of arenas wouldn't rent to pro wrestling because of the Yakuza stuff that came out. And then Baba, who had that sparkling reputation for being like clean, when he took over, it was like, he kind of brought like the late 60s, with Baba and Inoki's tag team. That was a boom period for wrestling. And then, then they split. And then in the 70s, there was some struggling. Both companies had their ups and downs in the 80s. In the early 80s, really, they both kind of like took off again.
Hey, Dave, if you could, just for the 605 listeners, try to just put into perspective just how big Riki Dozan was.
I mean, Riki Dozan and Luthez did an 87.5 rating on television.
Wow.
That's like double the Super Bowl.
I mean, is he, just to quantify it, though, I mean, was he essentially like up there with like the way that Muhammad Ali would be in the United States?
Ali would be the comparison, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know. I think that he, you could say maybe because of the war and them losing the war and his significance, that maybe he was bigger than Ali in Japan than Ali was in the United States. But I would say that that's like the comparison. Ali, bigger than Michael Jordan for sure. People think like Hulk Hogan. I don't think it's enduring as Santo though. I mean, Santo is more enduring because of the movies and everything and everything. Because like people still know El Santo and people know the name Riki Dozan in Japan, but it's from another generation for sure.
What about like Babe Ruth?
It's hard for me to say because I wasn't around for Babe Ruth.
Yeah.
Santo is still so over that sometimes when I go to the local Lucha indie shows, if I have my Santo and Cavernario shirt, like little 5-year-old kids, hey, look, mommy, he's got a Santo shirt. Well, I mean, everybody knows him.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like I think he's more enduring than any of them. But I don't think him at his peak was as big as Riki Dozan. I mean, I don't think there's any, in that sense. But, because of the movies and everything, he was, yeah. Because, I mean, the biggest in the United States of our generation would be Hogan. And I mean, Hogan was really big, but it's a completely different level.
Yes.
The topic of Riki Dozan is probably a good time for me to mention that I voted for the Sharp Brothers this year for the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. I think they can't be denied. I just don't think you could deny.
Historically, that program put wrestling on the map in Japan. Riki Dozan and Masahiko Kimura against the Sharp Brothers.
Yeah.
And you've probably seen the footage of everyone in the parks watching, because in 54, not that many people had television. So they would have these giant screens at the parks, and there would be like thousands and thousands of people hanging everywhere, watching Ricky Dozan's, not just the Sharp brothers, but that was the first one, and later like Jesse Ortega and the different guys that were brought in that he did his big matches with Lucha and others.
I want to do a little change of topic here. I mentioned Bull Nakano at the top of the segment, and I guess we'll start with you, Jeff, because we've all heard your story of your potential liaison with Bull Nakano in the elevator.
In the elevator, yeah.
I'd like to hear
one of the great lost moments of my life.
I'd like to hear Dave tell his side of the story.
So it's funny because I'm in the elevator when this is happening, right? And I'm actually seeing this, and like when it's over, I'm kind of like, I remember I look at Jeff, and it's one of those things of, did this really happen, or did we just like?
Unfortunately, no, it did not happen.
Yeah, and Dave, you told me that story when I was with you in Japan. You told me that story, and I just thought, who is this Jeff guy? He is a fool. He walked away. He walked away.
No, let's be clear. She walked away. I was still in the elevator with Dave.
Yeah.
And then you saw Bull Nakano in 1990, Kurt. You've been in love with Bull Nakano for years. Your dream was what, a leg drop off the top rope from Bull Nakano?
Oh, yes, and then strangling me to death with those nunchucks as she stares into my eyes and say, tell me what it feels like to die. It's a fantasy I'm sure everybody has. I mean,
that's a little dark.
Have you guys seen pictures of Bull Nakano this year?
She's really looking good.
Yeah, she's really pretty.
But she lost too much weight, man. I mean, I can't picture her doing that leg drop anymore. I mean,
you wouldn't even know it was her. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I know. I miss the old Bull.
So yeah. Brian, now that we got back to the All Japan Women, I wanted to get back to that night, and I want to read Dave something. Dave, you wrote this back in December of 1987. You remember the 10-woman elimination tag match from that night?
Oh, God, that was like the greatest match I'd ever seen up to that point in time.
Well, this was actually the quote from Dave's Observer. He said, the main event was by far the greatest match I've ever seen live. In fact, I'd say without question, it was better than any match ever held in the United States in the history of the business.
Wow.
It was. It had to have been.
So
that match wasn't that match like unbelievable? It was like this nonstop match. And it's just, and it's almost like the heat. I mean, that's the thing, is the heat was like so off the charts for like the whole match. The people just screaming at screaming so loud. I'd never seen anything like that in my life.
Well, and at the end of the match, Dave turns to me and goes, that may have been the greatest match I've ever seen in my life.
Well, he's consistent. You see, that's a good thing. And that match did make your top 100 matches of the 80s in the 1989 Observer Yearbook.
Absolutely. It was amazing. And I'll tell you one other thing about that night that was that I remember is looking at the merchandise stands. I remember Dave telling me, the promotions from the United States really need to come over here and look at the way they do this stuff. Because
now they do.
No, of course, but it was absolutely amazing.
They do, but they were like, that's another thing where they were like, 10 years ahead of us. I mean, that merchandise stand with all of the different things that they were selling and the DVDs and it was amazing because remember the lines for the merchandise, and it wasn't like you went there and bought a T-shirt. It was like people had these bags and they spent like $100. Back then $100, $100 in the 80s, a lot like $250 now. But like they're just piling stuff in the bags between tapes and streamers and the different books and everything like that. It's just going into that building, Korakuen Hall, the first time to see All Japan Women, it really was like going into a different world, a world that I'd never been before.
Yeah, and it's still, I still remember almost 30 years later how over Chigusa was with that audience. It was just crazy.
Oh yeah. And not, and Dump Matsumoto as well. I mean, as far as in Bull, but I mean Chigusa and Asuka as well.
Sure.
But yeah, Chigusa was certainly the star, and she had unbelievable charisma.
And that night was the night of Devil Masami's retirement from All Japan.
The first of many retirements.
Yes. But at the time, it was incredibly emotional. Because
remember we were talking. Didn't you and I talk to Chigusa, and she said she wanted to go to Calgary and Boston? Do you remember this? Yeah. It's like, do you want to go to? It was funny because it was like she wanted to go to Calgary because in Japan it's like Calgary is this great metropolitan area in North America because I guess because Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith came from there, or Bret Hart, or But it was like Calgary and then Boston because of the Boston Crab, which was like her finishing move. She wanted to go to Boston.
That's right. I remember that.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
I go to Boston Crab, right?
Yeah.
I think the only thing that night that we did not get to meet Dump after the matches, because I think we met either before or after the matches. We met most of the rest of the girls, and we wanted to meet
we met Devil Masami right before she retired. Yeah,
and we wanted to meet Dump, but Dump didn't want to come out after the matches. That was the only disappointment of the evening. Trust me, because the rest of the evening was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Dave, I think I know the answer for you. Jeff, Kurt, did both of you or either of you get a chance to go to the Ribeira Steakhouse?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes, I did.
Yeah.
I remember every photo.
Every trip, I would probably go 2 or 3 times, just because that was just what you did when you were an American tourist and you're in Tokyo, and you're going to wrestling. You go to the Gotunda Steakhouse up on the hill of Gotunda Station.
And I love the photographs of the Freebirds on there where they write something to Ribeira and then they write, "Fuck you, Ole Anderson."
The one that I loved was Harley Race and Nick Bockwinkel, who were together in the tag team tournament in '84. And so there's a picture of the two of them together. And Harley Race, who took that NWA title really seriously and just like 6 times real REAL, underlined world champion. And then Nick Bockwinkel signs it like 2 times semi-real world champion.
I forgot about that. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I said it the way I did, Brian, was because, unfortunately, when I got back to the United States, I made the ill-fated decision to give my Ribeira Steak jacket to the girl I was dating at the time, who was not one of my 3 wives. And, that was not a good choice.
I gave mine to Bill Anderson because the only size I had was so huge, I could have used it for a sleeping bag. So I gave to Bill Anderson.
It's funny because years later, when the Ribeira Steakhouse thing was in vogue again, I went to my closet and I'm just looking, and it's like I had no Ribeira jacket, and I had several of them. And I just go, "What happened?" He goes, "Those things." My wife just goes, "Those things were so ugly. I got rid of them." I go, "No, my God, you don't realize it's like the ugliness was the charm of them, and they're like collector's items. The original '80s Ribeira jackets." Oh,
it's like the '60s earth tones and tiki culture. They're tacky, but they're so endearing at the same time.
Yeah. It's like memories of like when the Road Warriors would walk around with those Ribeira jackets, it became like the big in thing, or Terry Funk or somebody, or Brody.
Dave,
the other memory I have is that first night we went to Kirkon Hall for the Lucha show. And I remember when the show ended, you said, "We can't go yet, Kurt. You have to watch them put away the chairs and take down the ring." I mean, what? And they were like an army of ants. They did it so just...
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember how long it took. It was record time. I mean, it looked like they were in a competition. Quick, yeah, that was actually really impressive.
I was going to say, Dave, before we started taping, I was telling the guys, just because we were discussing when I was there in '87, what do you remember about in August of '87, Summer Night Fever, the New versus Now? Because I got a chance to watch that match for the first time in about 25 years the other night, and I thought the roof was going to blow off that place. The heat was so intense for all those guys.
It's funny because it's on New Japan World, and every now and then somebody will, I guess, stumble onto it, and when they, they'll tweet me, and they go, "Do you know what's the story behind this match?" And it's like you can't really answer in 140 characters. It was like you had to be there, you had to understand. But yeah, it was unbelievable the way the match was set up, the feud, and then that match itself, and the underlying thing of when Maeda and Inoki did the double count out, and it was like Maeda just raised his hand in the air because Inoki would never let Maeda beat him, so that was as close as he's ever going to come, is for them to go over the top ropes together in this match. That was you know what I mean. It was like such an unbelievable moment because Maeda was supposed to be the next Inoki. It never turned out that way, but that was the idea. But Inoki would never put him over to let that happen.
Well, and one of the other things about the match was you essentially had, it was really new versus old, but of course Inoki didn't want to be called old, so they made it now. But they had Kijimuto as the last guy on his team, and I felt like that night they really made Muto a star.
Right, yeah, because he wasn't a big deal then at all.
No, he had just got back from Florida earlier in the year, and he was working like tag teams with Koshinaka and stuff like that. But I really felt like that match put him over to the audience as a like the next big star in the promotion.
Yeah. When I think the difference between Inoki and Baba is I think Inoki wanted to stay Inoki forever, where those last years Baba realized he's not the NWA champion contender anymore. He'd have those six-mans with, was it Kusatsu?
Baba, who often teamed with Masafuchi, Misawa Noe, Rusher Kimura, Egan.
Yeah, he put himself lower on the card. I assume he knew that he could
intermission.
Yeah, he knew, I can't pass myself off the way I did in my youth.
Oh yeah. I mean, the thing, what was cool about Baba, yeah, and Inoki always had to be main event, right? And Baba was mid card, but the thing with Baba was he would do those 6-man tags. They were easy matches and all that, and then like once or twice a year, Baba would just do like a serious match, and it was so unique, and it usually worked. But he'd only do it on rare occasions. But yeah, no, I mean, Baba really by 82, I think mentally was just like Tsuruta's the guy, and Tsuruta was the guy from like 82 to 90, and he still was until his health problems, but with Misawa, and then in the late 80s you had Tenryu as well and others. But yeah, Baba was, from 82 on, he never tried to make himself out to be the top guy, and he went another 17 years, doing the comedies matches. But Inoki. Inoki never wanted, the only thing that got Inoki out of the top spot was that he won the Senate race. I mean, that was really the thing.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. The wrestling wise, it was like, I'm ready for my close up, Mr. DeMille.
Yeah.
Hey, Dave, I wanted to ask you, this question came up the other day. When Shoshu jumped back from All Japan to New Japan, why did Yatsu stay with Baba?
I don't really remember, other than I think that he was more, I think that he got comfortable and everything like that. And I think a lot of them really liked working for Baba, but you had that loyalty. But I think that he just was, you got to remember that most of those guys were stars in New Japan first, and Yatsu really wasn't, and Baba picked Yatsu because remember when they came over, the tag team was Choshu and Hamaguchi, but Baba thought Hamaguchi was too small to be in the top mix. So he made it Choshu and Yatsu that were feuding with Tsuruta and Tenryu. So maybe there was that loyalty. I'm not really sure. But yeah, he wouldn't go back.
Well, on the topic of Baba, Dave, I have to ask you a question. It has been something talked about multiple times on the Super Podcast. I believe one, if not both, of the other men on the line have brought it up. It's been a rumor, so I'm going to ask you yes or no if it's true or not. Did Mrs. Baba ban you from All Japan because Mike Lano showed up with a group of people and said Dave Meltzer sent me?
Not banned. That's not the right word. But it was night and day. Yes. It was night and day different. because at the end of the Misawa Tsuruta match, and we're all crying, seeing this amazing thing, and Mrs. Baba's crying. I remember walking by Mrs. Baba, and she gave me this towel, which was a All Japan towel. So she obviously liked me, and she was, the next time I go, I'm thinking, and then it's like where, she thought I was like some spy from like the, whatever, and like the talent that talked, was that talked to us was like, it was like thing. Cause I remember like Dory Funk Jr. came and just goes like to me and just goes, I just want to apologize for my boss. It was very rude, the way and it was, and I couldn't understand what the difference was. And then somebody in Japan goes, oh, Mike Lano was here like with a group like a couple months ago. And well,
he was with like Steve Gerber, Greg Regalado, Andy Dragos, and I can't remember which one of them told me, but they said he was actually screaming at Mrs. Bob because she wouldn't let him take photos, and that he was dropping your name.
Yeah, well, see, that's what I didn't even know this. I just knew it was night and day different, and then somebody in Japan explained to me, they just said that like there was a group of Americans that were here a couple of months earlier, and they were the ultimate ugly Americans. And now that's what they think of you. So there you go.
With Lano as the leader.
Before I was cool because I went there and minded my own business and never caused any trouble, and the wrestlers liked me.
When I was there, Mrs. Baba totally loved you. She was like so jazzed to see you that time.
I know. Isn't that like the saddest thing in the world? And she didn't like anybody.
I remember Mrs. Baba gave us the Funks T-shirts and all the bunch of stuff from the merchandise table.
Yeah. So it's at 87 and 90, and I mean it was like, because every time I would come, like she was so nice, and then after it was like, and everyone would call her Dragon Lady and all this, and I go, wow, she's so nice to me though. And then she was Dragon Lady after Mike Lano came, yeah.
Well, another name that has not been brought up yet is Wally Yamaguchi, but I have a feeling he fits into some of these trips.
Hotel Wally.
We all stayed with him.
In fact, Dave, remember how we checked into a hotel, and that night Wally called and was saying something like, "You son of a bitch, Dave, why aren't you staying with us?" So we saved a boatload of money on like a lodging. So I bought so much stuff there in Japan, I could barely pick up the suitcase when we went back on the
remember how heavy the suitcases when we went home? Oh my God, yeah. And that's before they had like the rollers and everything.
And they didn't make us pay any custom fee or anything. You could barely lift those fuckers.
God damn, we bought so much shit, yeah.
I know. Remember the wrestling store?
Well, there's a couple of them, but yeah, I remember the one. Because they never had them in the United States at the time. So you go to the wrestling store, and it was like, oh my God, they would have like these magazines from 20 years ago, and all these DVDs from Ricky Dozan days, and T-shirts, and just like incredible stuff. I'm sure they still have them now, but I remember being blown away how the address system is so whack there that we couldn't figure out how to get to it, and how that one waitress at the hotel, or the hostess at a hotel, actually walked us down the street to help us find it. I thought, damn, that's hospitality. Oh, the people there are so nice at some points. It's weird because they're so nice, but yet at other points they could be so racist at the same time. Like if you're in the wrong thing or something like that. Like you go to I loved this experience in life. Because not that I loved it when it happened, but I remember we were in a small town. I don't remember which trip this was. I don't know if you guys were on this one or not. But we were in a small town, and we stayed late, and we were trying to get a cab, and no cab would like pick us up. And like we would go to restaurants, and this is not in Tokyo. This would be in a small town. They wouldn't serve us, and it was like the whole thing. And somebody even mentioned to me, goes, "Well, now you probably have a really good idea about what it was like to be black in the 1960s." And it was like, and when I was told that, it was like, I'm really glad this happened, because now I can understand that, which you couldn't any other way, and it made me like really hate racism, in a way that in fact I probably never would have learned to hate racism. I mean, I would have hated it anyway, but from the firsthand experience of actually where you're they won't serve you at a restaurant because you're American, or the taxi drivers will not pick you up because, you're American.
I'll tell you a similar story, but from a different angle. I remember when we were in Osaka, and I don't know who we were with. It was either Wally or Fumi or Koichi. And we're walking through, let's be kind, the red light district, and the ladies were out. And every time when we would walk past the ladies, they would turn away from us. And we looked at our Japanese, whoever we were with, and we said, "What's the deal with these women like turning away from us?" "Oh, it's because you're Americans. They don't want nothing to do with you."
Yeah.
Damn.
Dave, one of the things that is so cool from this era are those Japanese magazines, and there are so many people that collect them. I recently got a few old ones. I'm wondering, when you guys each first saw the Japanese magazines, but specifically Dave, what was it like for you when all of a sudden they started covering the Observer Year-End Awards in the magazines over there?
Yeah, I thought because when they did that was really cool. I started seeing Japanese magazines, I would like to say, at least going back to 1974. And they didn't have the weeklies then. That was the monthly big magazines. The weeklies came, I'm thinking, in the early 1980s. But I got them all sent to me all the time. And I took photos for when, not the Shire days, but the AWA days. I would take I'd go to the Oakland Coliseum for the AWA shows and shoot photos at ringside for the Japanese magazines. So I was always getting them, and I think I got hooked up. Well, I mean, I was friends with Koichi, so he was always like the conduit to that. And I remember Dan Westbrook, who you guys Jeff won't.
Oh yes, I know Dan.
Yeah. So Dan Westbrook came up and stayed with me one of the years when he came for the San Francisco Battle Royals. This is early 1970s. And, he was shooting for, the Japanese magazines. And that's when I kind of like started like kind of, oh, what is this and everything like that. So, and then, I probably have been in contact with Koichi Yoshizawa, I'm going to say 1974. So that's.
Wow.
Yeah, 43 years.
I bought my first Japanese magazine from Judo Jean LaBelle at the Olympic in 77.
Yeah.
Jeff, when did you first see the magazines?
I'm thinking, I think Pete Letterberg lent me some of his Japanese magazines that he'd gotten. So it probably would have been the same time period, about 86, 87-ish. I was sitting there thinking you were talking about Wally Yamaguchi, and I remember a funny story about when we were staying at Wally's. Wally had, Dave, do you remember he had like a ring like in his basement or something?
The ring in like the garage.
Yeah. So we get in the ring and we're, and Wally and Dave and I and Dave Katz are just goofing around in the ring. So I do this bit where I hit the ropes and I'm running the ropes and stuff like that. And I'll never forget, Dave looks at me and goes, well, hey, you can hit the ropes. You know what that means? You're already better than Ivan Putski.
Oh, Dave, remember how when we were there, fans kept mistaking you for Chris Benoit and would come up for your autograph?
Yeah, they did that in 87 too.
Always. Well, the first time I went was before Chris Benoit was there, and they would always mistake me for Dynamite Kid. And Dynamite Kid was super over in 1984. So I mean, it'd be people screaming and everything. Kido, I love you, in English. I mean, it was crazy. But yeah, like the 87, and it's the weirdest thing because I don't think I looked anything at all like Chris Benoit. But when I was in Japan, like I would say that and goes, "Oh, you look exactly like him. What are you talking about?" It's like, and it's almost like the idea. I don't know, the idea like all Americans look the same or something. I don't know.
Oh yeah, all us honkies look alike.
Yeah, but yeah. Because remember, I would in '87. I remember he was he just started there, and he was Dynamite Chris, which was a name he hated. And I'd be like walking around, and people, Dynamite Chris, and I go, no, that's not me, like that. Yeah.
I remember at one of the small towns we went to, Dave, when the people would come up and go, Dynamite Chris, and they'd want you to sign autographs. And that's when I had longer hair, and Dave would point at me and go, see him? Michael Hayes. He's Michael Hayes.
Well, in fact, I remember at the Baba show, I can't remember what town it was, at the spot show where you're at, some kids came up when you autographed the T-shirt, and you started autographing their shirts, just writing other wrestlers' names.
Yeah.
And then, I can't remember how we knew this, but we knew the next wrestler that this one kid was going to ask for an autograph was Dustin Rhodes. And so you just had this mischievous grin on your face, and you wrote in huge letters, you autographed Dave Meltzer. Because I guess at that time, Dustin was pissed because I guess you were writing critical stuff about his dad.
I guess Dustin liked me because of what I wrote about his dad. Yeah.
Hey, Kurt, didn't you present an award to, was it Ultimo Dragon when you were over there?
Acai.
Yeah, Acai. Oh, yeah, it was a lot of fun. Wally just says, hey, want to give some gimmick to Acai? We could make up a trophy, and you could make some bullshit how he's like the wrestler of the year for your newsletter or something. And yeah,
yeah,
Cork on Hull, yeah.
I mean, that was really something seeing Acai, because that was like the tour where he first kind of like started to make it there. You know what I mean? Where he was like, because he was supposed to be the young boy, and Gran Hamada was supposed to be the star because he had tenure, but Acai just kind of got over as like a fresh face. And, it was the first time we had seen like the Acai moonsault and things like that, all the stuff that everyone's doing now. But when he did it, the rope walks and things like that, it was like so cool. And the entrance music and everything like that. He was, because people don't know it, but Acai was the one who really ushered in, like Mil Mascaras was the guy who would have exposed the idea of Lucha Libre in Japan, but Acai was the one who popularized real Lucha Libre in Japan, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, that was one of the most mind-blowing experiences for me, is that first night at Korakon, we're one of the restaurants downstairs before the matches, and there were Japanese fans with like Spanish-Japanese translation books.
Right, trying to learn Spanish really quick.
Yeah, and they all knew the customs, like throwing money to the wrestlers when there was a good match. That was so awesome.
Yeah. Japanese, I have to say, Japanese wrestling fans in that era were, they were the best in all over. I don't know if that's still the case now, although when I watch, New Japan, I still think that they're pretty great fans. But I loved going to Mexico to see wrestling as far as the fans. It's different. And everything, but The one thing that I remember is the first time I went in '84, and I noticed the very first show I went to, and it was like, these fans are exactly like me. Because I would go to like American shows, and it would be like, I'd watch the fans, and I was kind of like, I wasn't really, I wasn't in sync with them because they were always into like, a lot of bullshit and things like that, or just easy stuff. You know what I mean? Or they would be into the personality, but it would be like a shitty match or something. Whereas like in Japan, it was like, it's like you had to be good, and they just reacted exactly like I would react. It was really cool feeling.
Dave, let me just ask you a quick question. Something I noticed that you had written in that issue of The Observer that I referred to earlier was when you were talking about Dump Matsumoto and what a spectacle she was visually and what a performer she was and how the audience reacted to her. And you made a comment that if she had been brought over to the United States, that you thought within like 6 months, if she was pushed the right way, that she would have been on the cover of Newsweek. Do you remember saying that?
Yeah, and that never happened.
Yeah, but I mean, do you could you have
our loss?
Could you have seen, like, is that somebody that Vince could have ever pushed? Do you think he would have ever taken a chance?
Don't you think in the '80s that she would have been incredible because of the visual and just, but they never let women get so out of control, because one of the things, I don't think they would have ever wanted the women to outshine the men, because you remember when Asha Kong went. Because Asha Kong was supposed to work with Medusa. After Bull got fired or left or whatever the story was, they were going to bring in Asha. And then Asha, in her first match, like, she did so much stuff and was so stiff. And, they couldn't handle women hitting women that hard, Vince and all them. And also the other thing is that they couldn't handle, like, women stealing the show. You know what I mean? It's like, how can we follow this? So they just sent her on her way. So I think Dump It would have been the same thing. I mean, like, they had what they were going to promote, Hulk Hogan or whatever. And I don't think they wanted this, Japanese woman with, dressed up in Nazi regalia. You know what I mean? Like, carving up women with forks. I don't know that's really what WWE would have. I think they would have been really uncomfortable, because one of the things, like, for me, and I've always had the idea of women in sports as it's the same as the men. It's like I never like if I watched women boxing, my friend, and this is back in the 90s or whatever, 80s maybe, 90s with the Christy Martin era. Everybody be all, you see a woman bleed and it's all gross. And it's like, I see guys bleed in wrestling all the time. A woman with a bloody nose isn't going to freak me out. She's trying to do what she's trying to do, and it's like more power to her. I don't have nothing, you know what I mean? And it was like with watching like Dump Matsumoto, the fact that it was a woman doing all this crazy stuff, it didn't offend me, because I've seen guys do crazy stuff. But in our culture, we weren't, in Japan, it was still crazy, but in our culture, I think in a lot of ways, it would have gotten over like crazy if the promoter would have let it, but I don't think the promoters would have been open-minded enough to like not freak out over it.
Guys, as we begin to wrap things up, I want to ask you each the same question. When you look back at this period of time, the 80s in Japan, and for this exercise, we're going to include 1990, even though it's not technically the 80s, but it really is, as you pointed out earlier, Dave, the end of the era, at the beginning of the new era, with, Misawa and eventually all the young guys in All Japan and
right,
New Japan.
And it was really just before the Muto Chono Hashimoto era.
Right.
It was still the end of, I guess it was the end of the Inoki era, I guess you would say. Yeah. And in 87, when Jeff and I went, Inoki was still top dog. Even though he had slowed down. Jeff, you remember, didn't we see a tag match with Inoki and Murdoch?
Yes.
Where
that was
Murdoch was just freaking unbelievable.
Murdoch worked like 98% of the match, and then Inoki got in, and I think he worked like 2 minutes of the match, something like that. Hey, Dave, I wanted to ask you a question, because I mentioned something on either the 605 or my own podcast. Do you remember, and I think you're the one that told me the story, is it true that Joel Watts, you had sent him some videotapes of Davey Boy and Dynamite, and he had been trying to get his dad to bring them in, and his dad finally saw the match and said, wow, these guys are really good, and wanted to bring him into work midnight. And by the time they called, the Bulldogs had already signed with Titan. Is that true?
They had just signed like 3 days earlier.
Whoa! Yeah. Oh man!
Yeah. They were going to bring. Joel was pushing for it for a little while, so I had sent him this stuff, and Joel Watts just saw them and just thought, that they need to come in and work, because the Midnight Express were already gone. So it was going to be the Rock and Roll Express against the Dynamite and Davey Boy, who were not called the British Bulldogs yet. And he just thought that they would make great opponents, just because it's different from the Midnight. You know what I mean? Just different. Yeah. And Dundee thought that they wouldn't draw money. I mean, Dundee nixed it right away. They're not, these guys couldn't draw. So that was that. And then finally, Bill, I remember Joel called me up and just goes, my dad gave the okay. And I go, they just signed with WWF like 3 days ago. So it never happened. Yeah.
Now, Dave, there's something I brought up to Brian. I don't think he quite bought it when I said it, but like we've known each other for 34 years or so, something like that.
God, when did we?
Somewhere around there. But anyway, you and I have talked about this many, many times, and I know you'll back me up when we've always agreed on one thing, and that is the fact that throughout his entire life, that Dr. Jerry Graham never told a lie. Nor did he ever exaggerate. When he said
Dr. Jerry Graham is like this frickin' legendary character. Like you couldn't, like, honest to God, there should be a movie on Dr. Jerry Graham, except nobody would ever believe any of it, and it would all be.
That's why when people ask me you should write a book on him, I said, well, there's two things. One, who would ever believe it? And two, I couldn't just write a feel-good book. I'd want to know what made him tick, and it might freak me out if I found out what made him tick.
Dr. Jerry Graham, like the story about when his mom died. Oh, my God.
Absolutely.
Tell the story, Kurt, because that's like crazy stories.
It's very popular on the 605 podcast now.
Oh, you've already told it? Okay.
Yeah. It's even Travis Heckle did some artwork involving it, too. Yeah, well, he said that when Great Gama wrestled Stanislaus Obisco, that Gama screamed, Allah, 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 and then hit Stanislaus so hard on the top of his head that he drove him knee-deep in the mud. and so that renders all mixed martial arts just invalid. I mean, that's the toughest man in the world. I mean, only in a Flintstones cartoon have I ever seen that before.
Yeah.
Well, guys, as I was saying before, as we begin to wrap things up, I wanted to ask you, if we look at this period of time, the 1980s, those trips to Japan and what you saw in Japan, who was your favorite wrestler to see live? Who was the worst wrestler you saw on one of your tours to Japan? And what's the best match you saw live in Japan?
Okay, well, for me, Misawa, just on the level of it just being such a monumental moment. But my favorite, and this will never change, getting to see Negro Casas almost every night. And not just Negro Casas with the cream of the crop in the ring with him. Still my favorite worker to this day of all time.
You know what? I think that, if we look back at guys that are still active now, I think that, the two iconic figures to me are Jushin Liger and Negro Casas as far as full-time guys, in the sense of, these guys are if there's no-brainer there's no more of a no-brainer Hall of Famer than Jushin Liger, right? And there's others too, but Jushin Liger, just because of how many years he was great, and Negro's the same way in the sense of it's like I started watching Negro Casas in probably '84, and Kurt I think may have been the person who was the first one to tell me about
I was calling you almost nonstop, telling you how great he was, because I saw him.
Del Santo and Negro Casas and how great Negro Casas was. And I finally got a tape of him, and it was different. Then it's funny because now, I guess some people when they see Lucha Libre, it's still kind of different, but it was I'm watching Lucha Libre with American eyes still. So a lot of the stuff, I could see that the guys were talented, but I didn't always register with me until I started going. And then when you go, you kind of get in the flow of it, and then you really pick it up. You pick it up really fast when you go, and then you kind of see, hey, wait a minute, okay, this is what they're doing. So when I started going to Lucha Libre, everybody, then I realized these guys are just fantastic. But with Negro, the first time I saw him, it was just this guy was he's one of those spot on guys where you watch him and they're always in the right place at the right time to make the other guy look good. All the little things, they like a Terry Funk or someone like that. The guy, the other one who nobody knows, Kurt will know, and Jeff will actually probably know too, but Kurt really well. But I always think back, because people always go who's the most underrated wrestler of all time, and the name I always say is Jerry Estrada. That guy was unfreaking believable, and nobody even knows who he is.
I remember him.
And it's a shame how banged up he is now. I mean, I mean, up until his recent injury, Atlantis stayed pretty fresh for his age. Well, I mean,
what's amazing about Atlantis is he did all that high flying and he didn't have his first knee injury until he's like 53 years old.
Yes, exactly.
Hey, Dave, let me ask you a question. Kurt was talking on the 605 one time about a match, and I just watched it and was blown away. Do you remember the match between Sangre Chicano and MS1?
I don't remember it unless was that a super bloodbath match? Maybe.
Yes.
Okay, then I do remember it. Yeah.
The ladies at ringside were dabbing the blood with handkerchiefs.
Yeah,
while smoking a cigarette.
I remember
too.
seeing Sangre Chicana in super bloodbath matches. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was so over that they did the same main event next year at the anniversary show too, 2 straight years.
Yeah. Mexico's got some really cool history. You know, it's like a different world. But yeah, no, I mean that what was cool about that trip historically is, remember when we were in the weren't we in the van with Gedo and Jado and Sasuke right before they all started up and became stars? Do you remember that?
Yeah. It was before they did the Sasuke gimmick and stuff like that. They were on the undercard.
Before they did their gimmick, because we saw. I think that we saw Sasuke's first match. I think. If not, we saw one of his first matches. Because Sasuke, they did the Sasuke movie. I don't know if you know about that, but there was a Sasuke documentary.
Oh, I didn't know that. No way.
Yeah. Sasuke documentary. And it opened in San Jose, and Sasuke was there. So I saw him, and he just looks at me and just goes, "Dave Meltzer." And I go, "You know me?" And it goes, "Yeah, we were in the back of the van and before my first match." And it's like, yeah. And I remembered that. And the other thing that I remember, which is so fascinating today, is Gedo was there, and he was KT Takayama or something like that, or Bulldog KT, right? Bulldog KT.
That's right. Yes.
Bulldog. So Gedo's Bulldog KT, and I remember him in his broken English telling me about how much he loves the Observer, right? This is 1990, and now I'm thinking that this guy studied the Observer and studied all the stuff, and then frickin' he's a booking genius now.
That's awesome.
I never tell the story between him growing up reading the Observer and Joe Silva growing up reading the Observer, and they're like the two frickin' booking geniuses of two different sports. And people tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about.
And don't forget Jeff Bowdren, who was the booking leader of Fantasy
Jeff
Sports.
Jeff Bowdren. Oh my God! I remember when we used to do the Bowdren the Booker thing, and these guys in wrestling would go, "Oh fucking shit!" They would just freak out at some of the cleverness in that thing. It was hilarious. Oh my God.
Jeff, anything to say?
The book is forthcoming. That's all I'll say. End of the year. That's my time. End of the year. It will be going to the publisher.
Hey, Kurt, worst wrestler you saw in Japan?
Holy shit. Somebody probably on one of the FMW shows.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, remember, Dave, that was our first exposure to FMW, and we were saying how it's like a Japanese version of Memphis wrestling with lots of brawling. I was blown away that one night in Kirkham Hall when, at the end of the night, Onita was thanking people for coming, and some people in the balcony were chanting something rude to him. And he said something along the lines of, "We may be garbage, but even garbage has its pride." And when he said that,
pride, yeah.
Oh, I love that line. And when he said that, all the fans went ballistic.
Yep.
And they start throwing things at the guys up in the balcony, including one of those giant dry mops. They're hurling it up the balcony, and a couple of fans run upstairs to the balcony. I don't know if they ever caught the guys, but that was so amazing.
Here's another one. It's like FMW at that time, they were just starting, and look at they became like this weird thing. And I remember, so we never went to the shoot style stuff, but I went.
No, and there were no New Japan shows when we were there either.
Yeah, but I remember going to in the 90s, going to see Rings, which was really interesting, just because Maeda was so popular, and it was a very different atmosphere, date night atmosphere type thing, where it was like the rich kids, and the really pretty dates and everything like that. And it was like, I guess probably like going, what kind of sport would do that now in the United States? I can't really think of one. Not really. Maybe, I guess high level boxing probably has that, but it wasn't that it wasn't that kind of a rich crowd, like a high level boxing or like a big time UFC, where you're spending $1,000 a ticket. It wasn't that kind of.
But it was cool to be seen there.
Yeah. More than you would think it like pro wrestling or something like that. Yeah.
Jeff, best wrestler and worst wrestler you saw on your tour of Japan?
You know, I was thinking about that. Dave, was Wajima wrestling when we were there in December of '87?
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't remember if he started or not.
I think he was there. So I would say him, because I seem to remember him being pretty awful. The best, there's no question about it. It was Chigusa. And I'll tell you, Chigusa was so good and so over that I have a hard time admitting that Manami Toyota is better than her. You know,
She was, though.
No, I know it's true, but I love Chigusa so much back then that I can't stand admitting it.
Okay, she was better as a worker, but she wasn't 1/10 the star of Chigusa. But when I tell people that, I go like, she was Manami Toyota to me, as far as night after night, 300 nights a year for year after year, was the best female worker, worked harder, you know, athletic, the whole bit. But she was never close to the star of like the, you know, Chigusa and some of the other ones.
Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah.
You know, it really is interesting. As I'm thinking about this and trying to put everything in perspective, these two trips specifically, 87 and 90, it really it's two interesting periods getting kicked off. I mean, this 87 tour is right after the shoot kick, and that changes everything. And, you know, you brought up how in 1990, all of a sudden clean finishes became the in thing again. A lot of that had to do with the popularity of the UWF and the fact that there were
it had everything
finishes.
to do with the popularity of the UWF because they were getting popular with no TV, and Baba and New Japan as well. They both figured it out. You know, it was like the public was no longer, you know, they were getting to see clean finishes every time, so they had to follow suit. And it was hard for Baba because Baba's whole mentality was the top stars never lost. And now you had to really, it made booking a lot harder because now you had to figure out the top stars have to lose, but you still got to keep them as top stars still. So it was
Dave, let me ask you, tell me if I'm right or wrong on this. Can you see after Maeda leaves New Japan and he forms the old UWF, and then we got, you know, UWFI rings, can you see a timeline or a link to the eventual formation of UFC?
Well, UWFI to UFC, yes, because Funaki and Suzuki were in UWFI, and Karl Gotch always wanted to take it real. And then finally, like Funaki and Suzuki and Ken Shamrock, you know, were the masterminds of going real. It didn't lead to UFC. UFC really came from Art Davie, and Horian Gracie. So it's a different line of shooters. It's the Brazilian shooters, but the Japanese shooters formed Pancras. So, which led to, you know, Rings, which ended up going real, and the Rings was the place that introduced Fedor Emelianenko and Nogueira and places like that. And of course, UWFI introduced Sakuraba, and those guys all became big with Pride. So the Pride thing, you know, Pride 100% stemmed from pro wrestling. And I mean, people, you know, a lot of people in MMA don't really understand that. And Pride, you know, really, Pride was a pro wrestling promotion. I mean, the big star was Antonio Inoki. It was booked like it was a pro wrestling promotion. They did squash matches like pro wrestling. They marketed stars like pro wrestling. They did special effects that I remember seeing on the ring shows, but they did it even more elaborate in Pride. But yeah, I mean, like UFC to me is not pro wrestling and never was. But, you know, K1, you know, which again, Ishii, Kazuyoshi Ishii, who was the guy who headed K1, I mean, he learned all of his things from Rings and Maeda on how to present a show. And then they broke off and he did his own show, which was K1. And, you know, K1 had that great run there as well. So the K1 and the Pride, yeah, that's all influenced heavily by the presentation of pro wrestling.
When the UWF blows up in 1988 in Tokyo and things start changing the way we're talking about with the clean finishes, makes me wonder about Bruiser Brody. You always hear the hypotheticals. Would Brody have gone and worked with Hogan, or would Brody have eventually fit into ECW if he had still been working? But I'm curious what you think, Dave, how Brody would have reacted to the era of clean finishes coming into the big promotions.
I think he would have understood it because, I mean, he'd been careful, but I think that, you know, because if you remember right before he died, you know, Baba pretty much laid down the law with him and Jumbo. You're going to do a 1-on-1, and Brody did it without any complaints. So I think he would have adapted just like Stan Hansen did. You know, the whole thing with what would have happened with Brody is really determined on physically how much he could have held up. And I don't know the answer. He was 3 years older than Stan. He did have some injuries. That was a real tough All Japan style, but I think he would have thrived with it. And he had the aura. You know what I mean? In the sense, because look at Stan. Stan went till, what was it? Stan went till like 2000. and Stan was a key part of that golden era. And I think Brody would have been a key part of some of it. Perhaps he would have, gone with Onita and done I think Onita and Brody would have been the biggest baseball stadium show of them all, or equal to the Tenru one. And I do think that he would have for sure been in ECW and out of ECW and probably in WCW, and out of WCW in that era. But I think that he would have always had an affiliation with Japan until, physically he just would have to not, I think that he would be like Stan. I think that one day it would just be, I can't do it anymore and I'm done. I don't think that I don't see him staying and being like the Sheik or somebody like that, as a shell of themselves that are working in their 60s. But as long as he was in shape, and his body could hold up to it, I think he would have been a major player for sure.
Hey, Dave, let me ask you, do you think had he not had his own health issues, would Gordy eventually have become the number one American? Or do you think he had a glass ceiling that he would have never gotten past?
I think he would have been the number one American, but I don't think he would have been as big a star as Hansen or Brody. I think that as good as he was, I don't think he had the charisma those two guys had. But I think that he'd have been bigger than Steve Williams was, though. If you remember Steve Williams and when Steve Williams was at his real peak in the mid 90s and was awesome, I think Gordy would have been, because Gordy was better. I think Gordy would have been in that role. And I think like Gordy and Doc probably would have stayed a team. And I think that they would have been, just because of tenure and everything, and because they'd be working with Kawada and Taue and Misawa and Kobashi and then Misawa and Akiyama and all them, because they would have so many great matches. If Gordy hadn't have had the issues, I think that they would have been like, people would now say that they were like the greatest tag team maybe of all time. I think that they would have with more years, because I think they would have kept them together. I don't think they would have broken them up. And I think that they would have, because the wrestling got so good. And if you look at how Doc improved with that, I think Gordy would have as well. Because Gordy was the natural of all naturals. He's another one where it's really kind of sad to me that people don't know about Terry Gordy, because, he was just as a worker, I think he was better. I think as a pure worker, he was better than Brody or Hansen, because he could do more and he had the great timing and everything, but he didn't have he had charisma, but he didn't have their level of charisma.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yes, that's a fair assessment.
No, because I can't see Gordy getting to that next level. I could see them, making him maybe the top American, but I can't see him being considered at that level of Stan Hansen or Brody.
No, I don't. I think, but I think he would have been like bigger than like say Scott Norton or Steve Williams.
Yes.
Yes. Easily.
When you look at who the next generation of top foreigners were, he would have been. Because remember. Let's see, how old was Terry when he had the problem? 32? So he'd have probably had 8 to 10 really good years there, more. And then he would have had probably some time as like the kind of like the legend and like he'd start putting people over more and everything like that I don't know. Who probably would have surpassed him though, now that I think about it, was Vader. Because Vader did have more charisma than he did. And Vader could do it all also.
Yeah, and the thing about Gordy, too, I thought about recently, I think it was John McAdam, actually, who brought this up. But the whole idea, if you look at, like, the Von Erichs, if everything hadn't happened, and when the Monday Night Wars was going on, they would have all been in that age range of a Kevin Nash and a Scott Hall, even though they got started much later than him, because they were so young. And it's the same thing.
They were all younger than Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash wasn't Kevin Nash born in 58? 59, I think. So Kerry was born in 60, Gordy was born in 61.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And imagine like if, the Von Erichs, didn't have their problems. I mean, Kerry had more charisma than anybody. And Terry Gordy was like, yeah, they would have been, because if Kerry hadn't had his problems, I mean, my God, those guys would have been so big for years to come. But that's a tragic situation, that whole Dallas thing. It's like, the drugs, that's really what it was. It was just the drugs, just destroyed that place.
Hey, Dave, I couldn't let this end without, we were talking earlier about American promoters being stubborn in regards to using smaller guys. Please tell about the time you met Rey Mysterio Jr. for the first time.
So we were in Tijuana, and Kurt had told me about Colibri, this guy who was was telling me how he's like 15 years old, probably at the time, 14 or something. So I see him in the stands. He wasn't wrestling on the card. And he's, 5'4" and 115 pounds, 5'2" and 115 pounds. And it's just like, what a freaking joke. This guy's a pro wrestler. It's like I just took a look at him and it's like, oh my God. Of course, the first time I saw him wrestle, it was like, okay, this guy's great. No doubt about it. At least I knew it when I saw him wrestle. But I mean, remember when he first went to WCW and he went in the dressing room and they thought it was like a practical joke. Until
totally. I mean, I knew he'd get over in Mexico, but I was really jazzed when he was getting over like in ECW. But I never dreamed that he'd actually hold one of the WWE titles.
I'd never thought he would get over in WWE because I thought that they would never let him. And the only reason he really did, number one, is he had So I think don't even know people know the story. So when WCW folds, they had no interest in Rey Mysterio. They thought he was a joke. I remember once they'd watched like a Nitro. And Rey Mysterio is being interviewed by Gene, and Gene's towering over Rey Mysterio, and they're just like laughing, like, oh, they're pushing this guy, and look at this. So when WCW folds, they had no interest, but a lot of the guys like the Hardys went to like Jim Ross and everything. It's like, Rey's, he's a free agent, and we should bring him in. And Ross had talked to him, and kind of said like, when your contract's up, sit at home, which is a nice way of saying, we're not all that interested. Sit at home for a year. But people were going, all right, we'll bring him in. He does have a name value. So they brought him in, and they didn't do that much with him, but they treated him all right. And then what happened was they started seeing the quarter hours with Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero, and that's what sold them. And then the Hispanic rating for SmackDown was through the roof, and it was because of Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero. So it's like, they did see that those guys meant ratings, and then they pushed them. It wasn't like we're going to push them to the Hispanic community. I don't think that they saw either of them as that big of a deal. I mean, Eddie was cool to get because he was a great worker, and Ray was, Ray was famous and this and that. But I think that was more of, the way that the mentality was. But yeah, I mean, I remember like all, it's funny. People don't really understand, like it's everything is timing. Because if Ray was came 10 years earlier, he wouldn't have even had a prayer in Mexico. Because, in Mexico, they wanted to make him a meme at first. And
at best, he'd be a regional star.
He's smaller than Jarrito Estrada, I think.
Yeah, but he'd been like Jarrito Estrada or Octagon Cito and those guys. Because he'd done great there, but, it was a low ceiling for sure. But Conan just insisted to Pena, we got to do this. And it worked. And Pena, to Pena's credit, he took this unknown guy who was 17 years old, and he focused on him really big, and the guy got over. And I mean, I remember people going like, oh, you remember this stuff? Oh, the only reason Pena's pushing him is because Pena's gay and this and that. And it's like, yeah, this guy, it's like this guy, it's like, that's why he's pushing this guy. And it's like, the hell, it's like, this guy knows how to get over. I mean, you watch that guy live, and he knows how to get over, and that's the key. And Pena's no dummy, but people were so like, who could ever push a guy like this, right? At this size, it's ridiculous. And he was a real important figure in American wrestling, because if the fans had not taken to Ray, this whole generation of guys from like Bryan Danielson and stuff never would have gotten a break. Never. But once Ray opened up the idea that people will buy Ray against Randy Orton, which was tough, but once people accepted that, then Bryan Danielson or Ricochet or these guys, they can be main event stars anywhere.
Dave, you said at the top that Terry Funk had a philosophy, and we've heard it before, and usually it was pretty accurate, that Japan is 5 to 10 years ahead of what happens in America. I'm curious how much of that still is a sound philosophy, and also, if so, what, if anything, do we learn from what's happening in Japan now?
I don't know. I think the whole world is on the same plane because of the internet. You know what I mean? Because the wrestlers, like before, everyone had their own style of wrestling, right? And like in Europe, you wrestle a certain way, and in Mexico, you wrestle a certain way. Now everything's amalgamating. Like, you remember like the Mexican wrestlers that were great workers when they would come to the United States. I mean, one of the things that I thought was cool when I was a kid, because they worked a different style, like watching Gordman and Goliath, just an example. Were very, very different from the tag teams that I was used to seeing, but they were great. But the guys, or Mascaras or whatever, the guys in California, they learned to work with them because that was their money. You know what I mean? It's like you learn to make it work. Whereas when those guys, I guess the best example was the original Sin Cara when he went to WWF, and it was like we have to teach him to work our style.
Yeah.
And I was just like, it's not going to work. That's where it's not going to work. That's the whole mentality of why it's not going to work. You bring him in as a star and you have him do what he does best, not what you want him to mix in, to be like your style, because your style, he's not going to be that good because he's never worked it. And, but now that's not that many years ago, but now because of whatever, because of the tapes and everything, I watched the guys in, at Arena Mexico, like, Dragon Lee and those guys. And, they're working they're doing lucha style, but there's a lot of Japanese influence, and they could come to the United States, and they're not going to have problems that much with a lot of the independent workers. They may have problems in WWE because of, working too fast and all that, but they could come here and work on a PWG show or something like that and shine like crazy. And the point is that the Japanese learn from Americans, the Americans learn from the Japanese, the Mexicans learn, everyone's learning British. There's a lot of British style that's being used to a degree in the United States. So I don't think stylistically anyone's really ahead of anyone, although I think New Japan's probably like the closest thing to a ahead of the time style. But promotion wise, not so much. But if you watch other stuff, you can get ideas still. But I wouldn't say like now, before, like with the merchandise, right? It's like I learned about the merchandise, before Vince McMahon did. And Vince McMahon learned when he went to Japan, even though he'll say he learned from rock concerts. Vince went to those shows, those New Japan shows with his father, and saw, all the Inoki merchandise and everything like that, and the entrance music and all that stuff. They did that there years before here. So yeah, that there was definitely that. But now, now there's I think people are accepting the women's wrestling as athletes as opposed to just like, the beauty girls and all that. So I don't know that that's necessarily the case today, but I think it's still cool to watch Japanese wrestling because it just gives you a different perspective and different ideas.